Imagine swallowing liquid fire that burns at over 1,000 degrees. Except it is not fire, it is molten gold. And you are still alive to feel every agonizing second as it sears through your throat and into your stomach. This was not some medieval torture fantasy. This was the actual death of Marcus Licinius Crassus, Rome's wealthiest man. His legendary greed earned him the most ironically brutal execution in ancient history. In 53 BCE, Parthian executioners heated precious gold in ceremonial vessels. They heated it until it glowed like captured sunlight. Then they forced the Roman general to his knees in the desert, where his army lay massacred. Contemporary accounts describe how Crassus remained conscious as the molten metal poured down his throat. His eyes were wide with terror as it burned through his mouth and esophagus. The executioners had calculated the temperature precisely, hot enough to cause excruciating pain, but not so hot as to kill instantly. This was not merely an execution, it was the climactic moment in a campaign of revenge. The man who once declared that no one should be called rich unless they could maintain an army from their own resources was about to discover something terrible. His obsession with gold would become the instrument of his destruction. His death reveals the deadly intersection of greed, imperial arrogance, and the consequences of treating foreign peoples as sources of plunder. Chapter 1. The Golden Monster. Marcus Licinius Crassus did not inherit his vast fortune. He built it on blood, corpses, and the screams of Rome's dispossessed. His rise to become the Republic's richest citizen reads like a handbook for sociopathic capitalism. Each chapter was more disturbing than the last. The foundation of Crassus's empire was laid during Sulla's proscriptions. This was when Rome's dictator published lists of political enemies marked for death. While other citizens cowered behind locked doors, Crassus saw opportunity in the chaos. He studied the proscription lists like a merchant examining inventory. He identified wealthy senators whose confiscated estates would soon flood the property market. As executioners prowled the streets, Crassus positioned himself to purchase prime real estate for fractions of its value. But Crassus was not content to simply buy distressed properties. He actively lobbied Sulla to add names to the proscription lists. He targeted wealthy landowners whose estates he coveted. Ancient sources record that he convinced the dictator to condemn at least one man purely to acquire his property holdings. The victim was dragged from his home and executed in the forum. Meanwhile, Crassus waited with gold already counted for the purchase. His most infamous scheme involved Rome's frequent fires. These could devastate entire neighborhoods in a city built largely of wood. Crassus assembled a private fire brigade of 500 trained slaves, but they operated according to a business model that would have impressed modern disaster capitalists. When flames erupted, Crassus's men would rush to the scene. They would refuse to fight the fire until they had purchased the burning buildings and surrounding properties at panic sale prices. Witnesses described how he would arrive at fire scenes personally. He negotiated prices while families fled their burning homes. He showed no emotion watching structures collapse. He calculated property values even as residents screamed for help. Only after securing ownership would he order his slaves to begin firefighting, often saving buildings he had just purchased for a fraction of their worth. His slave gladiator schools represented another level of commodified brutality. Crassus owned training facilities across Italy where captured prisoners were forced to fight for entertainment. Unlike other gladiator masters who might show occasional mercy, Crassus treated his gladiators purely as business assets. He calculated their value based on crowd appeal and longevity. He disposed of those who failed to generate sufficient profit. When Spartacus launched his slave rebellion in 73 BCE, it began in one of Crassus's own facilities. The revolt was specifically about the inhuman conditions Crassus imposed on his fighters. After defeating the slave army, he ordered 6,000 captured rebels crucified along the Appian Way. This created a corridor of death stretching from Rome to Capua. The crosses were spaced precisely to maximize psychological impact on travelers. The psychological profile that emerges is of a man for whom wealth had become an obsession transcending rational limits. Crassus could never have enough gold, enough property, enough power over others. Ancient sources record that he personally counted his treasury regularly. He ran coins through his fingers like a miser from folklore. By 55 BCE, Crassus's fortune was estimated at 200 million sestertii. This made him wealthier than entire provinces. Yet, this vast accumulation brought him no satisfaction, only an insatiable hunger for more. He had become Rome's golden monster, a creature whose appetite for wealth had consumed his humanity. This psychological pathology would soon drive him toward the desert. There, his obsession would finally be satisfied in the most horrifying way imaginable. Chapter 2. Desert of Ambition. The Parthian invasion began with a lie. Crassus told the Roman Senate that King Orodes threatened the Republic's eastern frontiers. He claimed this required immediate military intervention. In reality, Parthia had maintained peaceful relations with Rome for decades. Crassus manufactured this crisis because he needed a war. Specifically, a war that would generate enough plunder to surpass the wealth accumulated by Pompey and Caesar. By 54 BCE, his psychological state bordered on manic desperation. Pompey had grown rich from victories in the east. Meanwhile, Caesar's Gallic campaigns were generating enormous wealth from captured territories. Crassus felt diminished by comparison because his wealth came from business rather than military glory. Roman culture valued martial achievement above commercial success. His peers never let him forget that his gold came from fire sales and slave trading. 40,000 Roman soldiers crossed the Euphrates River in spring 53 BCE. Contemporary accounts describe Crassus's mood as euphoric. He was convinced that Parthian treasure would eclipse even Alexander's legendary haul from Persian territories. But from the moment his army entered Mesopotamian territory, everything went wrong. The Parthians had been preparing for this invasion for months. They used their extensive intelligence network to track Roman movements. They understood Crassus's psychological profile, his greed-driven motivations, and his fundamental ignorance of Eastern military tactics. This was not going to be a battle. It was a carefully orchestrated destruction of Roman arrogance. The desert itself became an enemy more deadly than any human opponent. Roman legions were trained for European warfare against enemies who met them in direct combat. Mesopotamian summers were different, with temperatures exceeding 120 degrees Fahrenheit. Sandstorms could blind soldiers for hours. The Romans had no experience with such conditions. Parthian general Charina implemented a strategy of systematic psychological warfare. This was designed to break Roman morale before engaging in direct combat. His mounted archers would appear suddenly from behind sand dunes. They would unleash volleys of arrows, then disappear before Roman infantry could respond. The attacks came at random intervals, creating constant anxiety that eroded unit cohesion. The sound warfare was perhaps even more effective than the physical attacks. Parthian war drums were crafted from hollow bronze. They were capable of producing thunderous reverberations. These were positioned around Roman camps during night hours. The drumming would begin without warning, sometimes lasting for hours. This prevented sleep and drove exhausted soldiers towards psychological breakdown. Crassus proved completely inadequate as a field commander. His commercial success translated into military incompetence. He had never led troops in genuine combat. His previous military experience was limited to the slave rebellion, where he enjoyed overwhelming numerical superiority. The decisive engagement occurred at Carrhae. There, Serena trapped the Roman army in open terrain without access to water or defensible positions. When Crassus finally realized he was walking into a trap, it was already too late to retreat. The battle was less a military engagement than a systematic slaughter. Parthian horse archers surrounded the Roman formations. They maintained distances that made Roman weapons ineffective, while their composite bows could penetrate Roman armor. Most psychologically devastating was the death of Publius Crassus, the general's son. Serena deliberately arranged for the young man to be killed within sight of his father. Publius's head was then mounted on a spear and paraded before the Roman lines. By evening, 20,000 Roman soldiers lay dead on the desert floor. Another 10,000 had been captured, destined for slavery. Of the original 40,000 men who had crossed the Euphrates with dreams of Eastern gold, fewer than 10,000 remained alive. Crassus survived the initial slaughter only because Serena wanted him alive. The Parthian general intended to use Crassus as a symbol of Roman weakness, a living demonstration that imperial arrogance led inevitably to humiliation and death. His dreams of Eastern wealth had become a nightmare of destruction and humiliation. Chapter 3. The Mockery of Kings. The capture of Marcus Licinius Crassus was itself a masterpiece of psychological manipulation. Charina was the Parthian general who had orchestrated Rome's destruction at Carrhae. He understood that killing Crassus quickly would waste an opportunity for maximum humiliation. Instead, he devised a campaign of systematic degradation. This was designed to break the wealthiest man in Rome before ending his life in the most symbolically appropriate manner possible. The initial deception began with false negotiations. As Roman survivors scattered across the desert, Charina sent envoys to Crassus under a banner of truce. They claimed willingness to discuss terms for safe passage back to Roman territory. Crassus was desperate for any chance of survival. He agreed to meet the Parthian commander personally. The meeting location was carefully chosen for maximum psychological impact. Sirena selected a position between the battlefield and the Roman camp. There, vultures were already feeding on Roman corpses. The stench of death filled the air. Meanwhile, the sound of scavenging birds provided a constant reminder of Roman defeat. When Crassus arrived at the designated meeting point, he found Sirena seated on an ornate throne. This throne had been transported from the Parthian capital specifically for this encounter. The general wore robes of silk and gold. This presented a stark contrast to the blood-stained, dust-covered Romans who stood before him like beggars seeking charity. The conversation began with elaborate courtesy. Sirena spoke in perfect Latin and expressed regret for the unfortunate circumstances, but beneath the diplomatic language lay calculated mockery. The Parthian general repeatedly referenced Crassus's legendary wealth. He wondered aloud how Rome's richest man had come to find himself in such reduced circumstances. The trap was sprung when Sirena offered to escort Crassus personally to discuss detailed terms. As they walked toward the Parthian camp, supposedly under truce protection, Sirena's guards gradually surrounded the Roman party. When Crassus realized what was happening and attempted to retreat, Parthian soldiers seized him bodily. They stripped away his general's insignia and bound his hands with common rope used for livestock. Sirena's treatment of his prize captive reflected careful planning rather than spontaneous cruelty. Crassus was paraded before the assembled Parthian army. He was forced to walk in chains while enemy soldiers jeered and spat at him. The humiliation was choreographed rather than random. Each element was designed to maximize psychological impact. The Parthians understood that public disgrace was often more devastating than physical torture for members of the senatorial class. The desecration of Roman military standards provided another layer of calculated insult. Parthian soldiers brought the captured eagles before Crassus. They forced him to watch as they stripped away the golden ornaments and sacred symbols that represented Roman divine authority. The eagles were then thrown into the dirt and trampled by cavalry horses. Most psychologically devastating was the parade of Roman prisoners. These were survivors of Carrhae who were now destined for slavery in Parthian territories. These men had followed Crassus into the desert, believing his promises of wealth and glory. Now they marched in chains because of his incompetence. Their lives were destroyed by his greed-driven ambitions. Sirena's psychological warfare extended to systematic information manipulation. He provided Crassus with detailed accounts of the battle's aftermath. He described how news of the disaster would reach Rome and how the political consequences would destroy Crassus's reputation permanently. The Parthian general painted vivid pictures of Crassus's surviving family facing disgrace and financial ruin. But Sirena saved his most devastating psychological weapon for last. He revealed that Crassus's death had been planned from the moment Roman legions crossed the Euphrates River. They had prepared elaborate punishment specifically for Rome's wealthiest man. This was a form of execution that would make his name synonymous with the consequences of greed for generations to come. The nature of this planned execution was revealed gradually. Each detail was designed to build terror and anticipation. Sirena described how gold would be heated in ceremonial vessels until it reached temperatures capable of burning through human tissue. Most horrifying of all, he revealed that the molten gold would be poured slowly. This would ensure that Crassus remained conscious throughout the process. As evening approached, Crassus found himself alone in a guarded tent. He contemplated the horrific fate that awaited him. The man who had spent his life accumulating gold beyond rational limits was about to discover that his obsession would become the instrument of his destruction. His captors had planned poetic justice, so perfect it seemed like divine retribution for a lifetime of greed and cruelty. Chapter 4. The Golden Death. The execution of Marcus Licinius Crassus began at dawn on a day that would be remembered as one of history's most horrific examples of poetic justice. Parthian nobles had gathered from across the empire to witness the death of Rome's wealthiest man. They understood that they were about to observe not merely an execution, but a symbolic destruction of Roman greed and imperial arrogance. The ceremony was held in the courtyard of a Parthian fortress. Crassus was forced to kneel in the center while his captors arranged themselves in a circle around him. The positioning was deliberate, ensuring that he could see every face that had come to witness his humiliation. Among the spectators were Roman prisoners from Carrhae. These were soldiers who had followed their general into the desert and now watched him face consequences of his catastrophic leadership. Sharina had spent days preparing the execution chamber. He understood that the manner of Crassus's death needed to match the symbolic significance of the moment. Golden vessels were arranged on braziers, their surfaces gleaming in the morning sunlight like captured stars. The metal itself had been carefully selected, pure gold of the highest quality. This was the same precious substance that Crassus had worshipped throughout his life of accumulation and exploitation. The heating process began slowly. Flames licked at the bases of the crucibles while Crassus watched in growing horror. The Parthians had calculated every detail, ensuring that the gold would reach precisely the right temperature for maximum psychological impact. Too hot, and death would come quickly, ending the spectacle before it achieved its full effect. Too cool, and the molten metal would solidify before completing its gruesome work. As the gold began to glow within a fire, Sharina addressed the assembled crowd in Parthian. His words were translated for the Roman prisoners by interpreters who seemed to relish their task. He spoke of Roman greed, of the arrogance that had led Crassus to invade Parthian territory. He spoke of the justice that would now be served upon the man who had spent his life valuing gold above human dignity. The psychological dimension of these final moments was perhaps more terrifying than the physical torture that was to come. Crassus knew exactly what awaited him. He could see the molten metal taking shape in the crucibles. He could feel the heat radiating from the braziers as the gold reached temperatures capable of burning through human tissue. The anticipation was its own form of torture. Each passing second built terror that no human mind could fully process. When the gold reached optimal temperature, glowing like liquid sunlight, Sharina gave the signal for the execution to begin. Parthian soldiers seized Crassus's head, forcing his mouth open, while others positioned the first crucible above his lips. The man who had once declared that no one should be called rich unless they could maintain an army from their own resources was about to receive a lesson in the true cost of wealth. The first drops of molten gold hit Crassus's tongue with a sizzling sound that echoed across the courtyard. The immediate reaction was inhuman, a scream that seemed to come from depths of agony beyond normal human experience. The gold instantly cauterized his tongue and the roof of his mouth. This created wounds that would never heal while simultaneously inflicting damage that ensured he would remain conscious for what was to come. But the Parthians had not finished their carefully planned torture. The second pour was larger, forcing molten metal down Crassus's throat while he remained helplessly aware of every sensation. The gold burned through his esophagus, creating internal wounds so severe that breathing became an exercise in agony, yet the temperature had been calculated to avoid immediate death. This ensured that Crassus would feel every second of his golden dissolution. Contemporary accounts were recorded by Parthian witnesses and later transmitted to Roman historians. They described the horror of those final minutes. Crassus's eyes remained open throughout the process, wide with terror and pain as the molten gold continued its destructive path through his body. His hands clawed at the ground, seeking some escape from agony that transcended physical endurance. Meanwhile, his throat produced sounds that witnesses described as beyond human language. The third and final pour was the largest. This ensured that enough molten gold reached Crassus's stomach to complete the symbolic destruction. The metal, still hot enough to burn living tissue, created internal injuries so massive that survival became impossible. Yet even then, the end came slowly. Crassus remained conscious as his body began shutting down from trauma and blood loss. The moment of death was marked by sudden stillness. Crassus's body went rigid as the last of his life ebbed away. But the Parthians were not finished with their victim. Sharina ordered the corpse examined, confirming that gold had indeed solidified inside the throat and stomach of Rome's wealthiest man. The poetic justice was complete. Crassus had literally consumed the substance he had worshipped. His body had become a tomb for the gold that had defined his existence. The aftermath of the execution revealed the true extent of Parthian planning. Crassus's head was severed from his body and preserved. It was destined to serve as a prop in theatrical performances at the Parthian court. His death scene would be recreated on stage, with actors portraying the Roman general's final moments for the entertainment of audiences who had never forgotten the injuries inflicted by Roman imperialism. The hands that had once counted treasure beyond imagination were also removed. They were sent to various Parthian cities as trophies of victory over Roman greed. These grisly souvenirs served as permanent reminders that imperial arrogance led inevitably to destruction, that wealth without wisdom was merely delayed suicide. Most disturbing to Roman sensibilities was the treatment of Crassus's corpse after the execution. Rather than receiving proper burial rites, his body was left exposed to scavengers while his head and hands were distributed as political symbols. This deliberate denial of funeral honors represented a final insult to Roman dignity. It ensured that Crassus would find no peace even in death. The psychological impact of the execution extended far beyond the immediate participants. News of Crassus's golden death spread throughout the ancient world. It became a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked ambition and the consequences of treating other peoples as sources of plunder. The story resonated because it represented perfect justice. The architect of exploitation was destroyed by the very instrument of his crimes. In Rome, the news of Crassus's death marked the effective end of the First Triumvirate and helped push the Republic towards civil war. His destruction in the eastern desert created a power vacuum that Pompey and Caesar would eventually fight to fill. This led to conflicts that would ultimately destroy the Roman Republic itself. The golden death of one man had triggered consequences that would reshape the ancient world. The legacy of Crassus's execution continues to fascinate historians because it represents the intersection of personal pathology and historical consequence. His death was not merely the end of a life but the culmination of a systematic campaign of greed and exploitation that had corrupted everything it touched. The molten gold that burned through his throat was both punishment and symbol. It was a substance that had defined his existence, finally consuming his humanity completely.